Thank you, Pastor Ed. Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for inviting us. We are just overwhelmed with welcome we've received in the reception, and I mean, we're truly impressed with this presentation and our beautiful colors. For those of you that don't know, of course, blue and yellow is the color of the Ukrainian flag. And the reason for that, the blue on the top is for the sky, the beautiful blue sky of Ukraine, and the yellow is for the sunflowers. You know, Ukraine has a lot of sunflowers, and you'll see fields of beautiful yellow sunflowers, and that is why the flag is blue and yellow. As Pastor Ed said, there are a few of us here from our Ukrainian parish, and I will introduce them to you. In the front row is Bogdan Hirnyak, and Bogdan, it can be, in English, for short, it's Don, but in Ukrainian, Bogdan means gift of God. Of course. Marie Shandor. Another Bogdan Shandor, he will be addressing us in a few minutes. We have Helena Kulik. Now, Helena, by the way, was born in Ukraine, and she's recently here in America. Well, I'll get to that. Luba Marino. Luba, please stand. Daria Hirnyak, who is Bogdan's better half. And Larissa Vichri. We're a diverse group in that we're all of Ukrainian descent, but some of these people, some of us were actually born in Ukraine and left at a very, very young age when World War II broke out. Some, as Helena, she was born in Ukraine, of course, grew up under the communist system, is now living in the United States. And then there are a few of us that were actually born in the United States. I am a first-generation American. My parents were both Ukrainian, as are Marie and Bogdan Shandor. Again, thank you for having this prayer service for Ukraine. God knows that Ukraine certainly needs a lot of prayers. And I always say, good to have the Lord on your side, right? The Ukrainian people are very religious people. We have Ukrainian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholics. And as Ukrainian Catholics, we are Byzantine Rite. So we are still under the Pope, but we are Byzantine Rite. I just would like to share a little bit about this St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Mission Parish. I am the church liaison for this parish, as well as the treasurer, and we have a divine liturgy, which is the equivalent of the Roman Catholic Mass. We have it once a month at the end of the month, on the last Saturday of every month at 4 p.m. We have the divine liturgy at St. John Newman High School Chapel. We have Father Andrei Romankiw, who comes from Miami. He is the administrator and pastor of the Ukrainian church in Miami, Florida, and he travels along with Deacon Paul Galatza to do the service. So if any of you have never been to an Eastern Rite service, a divine liturgy, you might want to join us. You're more than welcome to join us. We'd love to have you. Before I introduce the main speaker here this evening, and we won't talk too long, but I just wanted to let you know, since you're in this Lely area, that we just have put up a display at the Lely Library. There's 3 display cases. So if you're interested, we have a beautiful display. Ukrainians are very colorful. We have our beautiful pisanki, which are the Ukrainian Easter eggs. We have a lot of embroidery on hand there. And again, we have some maps of Ukraine and some items of historical value. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Bogdan Shandor. He's a fellow American, American Ukrainian. By profession, he's an attorney and he's been very active in the American-Ukrainian political scene, both on a local level and on a national level. So I would call Bogdan up to the lectern, please.
Thank you, Natalie, for your kind introduction. I also want to thank Pastor Ed for your very, very kind opening remarks, as well as thank all the parishioners here for the fact that you have so warmly welcomed us to your church. I will focus my remarks on three areas. What is Ukraine? Who are the Ukrainian people? And what has the relationship been like historically between Ukraine and Russia? You'll hear me during this presentation very often refer to Vladimir Putin and things that he has said publicly about Ukraine. He is the one source of disinformation that I believe has caused more misunderstanding about the Ukrainian people than anyone. The origins of Ukraine date back to what historians refer to as Kievan Rus. Now, Kievan Rus may remind you of the word Russia, but that is where the similarity ends, which I will explain later. In the year 988 AD, Prince or Knyaz in Ukrainian, Volodymyr the Great, adopted Christianity as the official the official religion of the kingdom. He was already 500 years old at that point, having been founded in 482. To celebrate Christianity, Prince Volodymyr minted silver coins, which can be found in museums today. On the face side is an image of the prince. On the reverse side is the trident, or trezub, which is the national emblem of Ukraine. So one can say that this trident has been around for over 1,000 years. If you look at the Ukrainian symbol, it's the same symbol. These coins have been carbon dated and their authenticity confirmed. So one must ask, how is it that Putin and other Russians claim Kiev as their place of origin? If this was in fact the case, and I've been to Ukraine countless times, probably over 20, 25 times, to Russia many, many times, I did not find the trident or the trezub on one single banknote, official document, state symbol, or anywhere. And I submit to you, perhaps as a lawyer would, that if in fact they had their origins in Kievan Rus, they would have that trident in the Kremlin, and it's not there. Not only is it not to be found, but Ukrainians have been punished by the czars, communists, and Putin himself issued orders for displaying even so much as a flag or medallion containing the trident. In the year 1237 AD, Kiev was overrun by the Mongols, led by Batu Khan. They sacked, burned, and killed all of Kiev's inhabitants. This was the conclusion of a 5-year siege of the city. You can imagine, 5 years they put up fighting. They didn't give in until everybody was killed. With regards to Russia, the earliest references to what today is Moscow is found in the year 1147. And in those references, it is called Muscovy. And its inhabitants are referred to as Muscovites. This developed into the Duchy of Muscovy, and all historic documents, treaties, and chronicles refer to the Muscovy state. The first reference to Russia to be found anywhere in historic documents is to be found in the early 18th century when Peter I, who the Russians refer to as the Great, returned from his travels to the West and felt inadequate as a czar. His inadequacy was due to the fact that he could not trace his lineage back as far as the royalty of France or Great Britain could. When he realized he could usurp the history and ancient traditions of Kievan Rus, he adopted the word, refer to his people as Russia. That's where the term comes from. Vladimir Putin has said that on one hand, Ukraine was never a country, and that the Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, he would make Peter I very proud. Let's examine what makes Ukrainians different from Russians. We can start with language. Ukrainian and Russian are very different, in fact. Russian has 3 letters in Cyrillic that do not exist in Ukrainian, and Ukrainian has a soft sign, which does not exist in Russian. I speak Ukrainian as well as I speak English, better for worse. As I traveled to Russia in the 1990s, I had to learn Russian because of the huge differences in the languages. I also spoke Spanish quite fluently at the time, and I will say that the differences between Russian and Ukrainian are very comparable to the differences between Spanish and Portuguese. The second difference between Ukrainians and Russians is the love of freedom and democracy, shared by all Ukrainians. This dates back to the Cossacks, who voted for their leader, who they called the Hetman. Cossacks were Ukrainian, not Russian, and showed tremendous resilience in fighting the Russians. In fact, Ukraine's national anthem references the traditions of Cossacks. The canals of Petrograd, or what is today called St. Petersburg, were excavated by 100,000 Cossacks who had been taken prisoner. In 1710, the head of the Cossacks, Hetman Philip Orlik, drafted the first constitution that separated the government into 3 branches: the Hetman or executive branch, the deliberative or legislative branch, and the judiciary. Some 65, 67 years later, that became very important in the history of our country here. There's no such example in Russian history. In fact, I read and traced Russian history back over 500 years. The Tsar Ivan IV was better known and referred to as Ivan the Terrible. His legacy really is quite horrible and terrible. It has been confirmed that when the St. Basil's Cathedral was completed in Red Square, and it really is a beautiful cathedral, he had the eyes of the architect gouged out so that the architect could never produce another church as beautiful. I found that in that period of 500 years, there were only 20 years of what can be called democracy in the history of Russia. And all of that was in the 20th century. A Columbia University professor who I told that to looked at me and says, "Bowden, you're being very generous." The third distinguishing factor separating Russians from Ukrainians is Russian brutality. Many historians attribute this attribute of Russian conduct to the historical 300-year relationship between the Muscovites and the Golden Horde, which ruled the territory of Muscovy. During that period of time, the Muscovites paid tribute and taxes to the invaders. They intermarried with them. They, in fact, adopted their methods. These methods included savageness and barbarity. The 300 years, when you consider it, is longer than the history of the entire United States. To me, is mind-boggling. The ancestors of today's Russia became partners with the Golden Horde after they intermarried and copied their ways. And I believe that's what you see throughout Russian history. A fourth difference is intolerance of others. Ukraine is a tolerant society. Putin views tolerance as a weakness. Last week, he reportedly told his invading troops that they were invading Ukraine to denazify the country. Since Ukraine's elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish and won election with a 70% plurality, the absurdity of that statement is self-apparent. A French writer, Charles-Louis Leger, wrote about these differences as follows. He wrote, "The Ukrainians are more magnanimous, more sincere, more polite and hospitable, more industrious than the Russians. They offer living proof of the superiority which civil liberty gives to men over people born in slavery. Vladimir Putin has been known to say that Ukraine was never a country. Frankly, what Putin does not know about Ukraine's history would fill a very big book. In 1918, during the Russian Revolution, the western part of Ukraine declared independence from Russia and formed the first Ukrainian republic. My maternal grandparents were both living in that part of Ukraine, and in 1920, they traveled as members of a world-known choir known as the Koshitz Choir, which is named after the founder and conductor. I have in my possession and intend to donate it to a museum, the original passport that my grandmother was issued. And on that passport, you have the trizub, the trident, once again, the symbol we were talking about from the very beginning. You also have stamps from all the countries that they visited, the capitals of those countries: Paris, Amsterdam, Bern, Switzerland, Berlin, London. In each country, they were recognized and accepted as citizens of a country named Ukraine. So once again, when you think about what Putin says and spews, the lies that come out of his mouth, it's absolutely horrifying. Ukraine's history with Russia includes countless horrible instances of persecution dating back to the czars. After all, if you are going to assume a nation's historical identity, it's best not to have any opposing views. I will only review several events over the last 200 years that point to this persecution. Ukraine's poet laureate, Taras Shevchenko, wrote poems about Ukraine and its aspirations for freedom. He wrote these poems in the Ukrainian language, which infuriated Tsar Nicholas I. So much so that he exiled Shevchenko to Siberia and then banished him from ever living in Ukraine again. Shevchenko continued to write, and the story is told that while in Siberia in prison, he had his words written in coal on shovels, which were then taken outside the prison, and the words were reconstructed in order to recreate those poems. Obviously, the poems that he wrote in Ukrainian were banned, but he also wrote in Russian. And again, the Russians sought to take on the identity of Ukraine's poet laureate. And those poems that were in Russian were lauded as wonderful poems, which they were. But they didn't deal with Ukraine's independence. They dealt with things like beauty of nature, beauty of mountains, beauty of skies, beauty of people. Didn't talk about Ukraine. In 1964, as a young child, I was present in Washington, D.C. when a monument to Shevchenko was unveiled at 22nd and Peace Streets. If you ever happen to visit, I suggest you go there. It's really a very, very impressive memorial to a wonderfully, very important person. Shevchenko was but one of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians sent to the Gulag for infractions like writing or speaking Ukrainian in public. In 1932-33, Joseph Stalin, himself a Georgian, implemented a program approved by the Russian Politburo of forced starvation of the Ukrainian people. All food was removed. All grains were diverted from the people of Ukraine who were growing those grains and sent into export for hard currency. Door-to-door searches took place where armed guards would go through pantries and take every last morsel of food out of their homes as the defenseless people watched. This led to cannibalism, which remains the darkest chapter of Ukraine's history. Approximately 4 to 5 million Ukrainians died of starvation, although some historians believe the fatal tally to be twice that. This horror has come to be known as the Holodomor, or murder by starvation. Ralph Lemkin, himself Jewish, coined the word genocide in describing the systematic destruction of a people by hunger. During World War II, Ukrainians again suffered when they found themselves caught between two monsters, Hitler and Stalin. Millions more perished, but the Ukrainian people did not give up. The conditions of Ukraine under communism were harsh, with any use of Ukrainian language, books, display of the trident, display of the blue and yellow flag, were punished by long prison sentences at hard labor in the far reaches of Siberia, what came to be known as the Gulag. And let us not forget April 26, 1986, when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Mikhail Gorbachev did not say a word publicly about what happened until reports came from Sweden which confirmed the high levels of radiation in the air. And that was some 10 days after the explosion. As the Cold War went on after the Second World War, it became clear that the Soviet Union could neither support itself nor maintain its Eastern European empire. I was in Moscow and Leningrad during 1990 and throughout the 1990s, as well as in Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. To say communism did not work out is an understatement of the highest order. Everything unraveled for the USSR when Ukraine declared independence on August 24, 1991. I was in Kiev both before and after that historic day. In keeping with Ukraine's democratic tradition, and this is really quite remarkable, the parliament passed a law requiring that the declaration be ratified in a nationwide referendum. In many cases, the parliament of a country would declare independence and that's it. They said, no, we want to make sure that the people stand with us. And the outcome of that was absolutely remarkable. I was there as an international observer. I had the high honor and privilege of acting as such after being invited by both the Ukraine's parliament, called Verkhovna Rada, as well as by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The ultimate result of that referendum was that 91.3% of the people across Ukraine voted for independence and sovereignty away from the Soviet Union. I might add that those areas of Ukraine that voted in favor of it, which, all of them, but it included Crimea, it included Donbass, it included the areas that Putin claims are Russian. They wanted nothing to do with them. They wanted independence. There were only 57 international observers at the first referendum and election. I was again fortunate to be the chair of the U.S. delegation representing the Ukrainian American Bar Association, of which I am also a past president. This past December, only 4 months ago, I wrote a 3-part article recalling my recollections and incredible experiences as an international observer. I now think how much has changed in these 4 months. In 1995, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum. You may have heard about this someplace, but it's an agreement between Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and Great Britain. Later, Germany and France joined in the agreement as well. This agreement provided that Ukraine's territory and territorial integrity will be honored and protected, and assurances were granted by Britain and the United States to stand behind Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up all of its nuclear weapons, which was the 3rd largest arsenal in the world, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,900 nuclear warheads. And they did it. Since 1991, Ukraine has moved steadily, but not always successfully, away from its Soviet communist history and aspired to become a stronger democracy and civil society governed by the rule of law. In 2004, Ukrainians rallied and protested the rigged elections that showed Viktor Yanukovych, a Moscow favorite, as having won the election. This came to be known as the Orange Revolution. The election was held again, and Russia's pick lost, only to resurface in 2010, seeking office again, but now shrewdly claiming that he really wanted Ukraine to become a part of Europe. He really wants Ukraine, and wanted at that time for Ukraine to join NATO. In November of 2013, after visiting with Vladimir Putin, Yanukovych came back to Kiev and refused to sign the necessary documents that would initiate the process of joining the European Union. Ukrainians again took to the streets throughout the country. In Kiev, Russian-supplied snipers opened fire on defenseless civilians in Maidan Square, which is referred to as Independence Square. These people were unarmed and protesting the betrayal by their president of his commitments to the European Union. In February and March 2014, Russia invaded Crimea and the eastern region of Ukraine known as Donbass. The Russian soldiers did not wear insignia on their uniforms, as though they could fool someone as to where they came from. Now, you recall the Budapest Memorandum. There was no action taken by any of the signatories to enforce, and there's a lot of discussion about whether there were assurances or guarantees. It's meaningless as to which word was used, because they didn't do anything anyway. It doesn't matter what you want to call it. It ended up becoming worthless. Today, Ukraine again finds itself under attack by the same Russian dictator. How this will end, I cannot say. But I am sure of one thing: Ukrainians will not stop fighting for freedom. I will conclude my remarks by reading the inscription from the back of the Shevchenko Monument in Washington, in Shevchenko's own words from one of his poems. Our soul shall never perish. Freedom knows no dying, and the greedy cannot harvest fields where seas are lying, cannot bind the living spirit nor the living world, cannot smirch the sacred glory of thee, Almighty Lord. Thank you.